Scale weight going up does not mean you are building muscle. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. Now, when we talk about fitness transformation, we typically think of physique development as this continuous bulk cut, kind of like ebb and flow, right? We've been told, like, the fitness industry just kind of made that a thing. It's like, we're bulking, we're cutting. And as time has gone on, like, I feel like you and I have actually, even though we're both chasing building muscle goals, we've moved away from using the term bulk quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll still use it with certain clients, but they know what I mean when I say that. But I think for us, we focus more on just like building. It's either we're in a building phase or a fat loss phase. That's kind of like two phases.
Yeah. Or maintenance phase, right? Because we've talked about that before too, like maintenance phases. But ultimately, like when we say bulk, or when the industry says bulk, what we're really talking about is putting on muscle, adding muscle, growing muscle. And with that, the goal isn't really to add a lot of body fat. Like, we're not just looking for like mass. We're looking specifically to build muscle, right? There is a distinction there around the goals.
100%. I think that's important. And especially some guys get carried away with this. I ran one of these when I was younger, just where you just pretty much eat almost as much as you can. And you just hope that you're going to build muscle. And you realize when you take all the fat off a lot later that, you didn't build as much muscle as you thought, and it just took you a long time to get back to a reasonable leanness.
Yeah, because body weight going up doesn't necessarily mean you're adding muscle.
Exactly, which I know we're going to dive into.
Yeah, otherwise we'd have a lot of jacked people running around in this world.
That is true. That is true.
Yeah. So today we're really going to explore that a little bit, and just kind of the relationship with this concept of bulking and adding mass, and like, going all out and eating a lot and this calorie surplus, like all those things we associate with bulking. We're going to unpack that a little bit and dive into how much do we really need to focus on in terms of calories when it comes to building muscle, and what is the distinction between an effective building phase and kind of maybe more of that, like, we use the term dirty bulk, where we start putting on just more excess body fat. And there's a lot of gray zone to this, which I think is our favorite thing, is exploring the gray zone. So we're gonna dive into some of that too.
100%. I'm ready for this one. Yeah.
Okay. So let's just start with the challenge that we see that kind of was the actual impetus for doing this episode. And you kind of alluded to it, but let's just have a moment and say, what's the common issue, challenge that people get carried away with when it comes to building muscle or bulking? That is the reason why we want to clear things up a bit.
Yeah, this part is more for, I see, with men than women, but they have a specific number in their mind. Like, a lot of guys want to hit 200 pounds or whatever, or they have some sort of idea in their mind of, I have to hit this body weight, and they're just eating as much as they can to just hit that. Whereas they have no business being 200. Like, if I was 200 pounds, I would be at a very high body fat percentage. I'm 175 right now, relatively lean, or maybe I'm 175, 177, somewhere in that range, depending on the day. And relatively lean. If I was 200 pounds and I got there in the next 6 months, I would have put on quite a bit of body fat.
Yeah, you're not going to put on 25 pounds of muscle in 6 months as an advanced trainee. Like, that's not going to happen.
And also, for me personally, I just have no business being 200 pounds, right? So I think guys have these numbers in their mind of what they have to hit, and they think just, if I eat more and gain weight, it's just all going to go to muscle. And I think that's kind of a little bit naive. And again, I used to think something similar when I was younger. So I'm not saying any shade to anybody, but I'm saying, like, that's why I see a big mistake.
Listen, that's been the narrative in the fitness industry for a long time. So we're not faulting people who feel that way, because that's what they've been exposed to. So when you think that's the right thing to do, you've been exposed to it because that's what was done before we had some of the new research that we have now that we're going to talk about. And also because let's just have a moment to be honest, a lot of that kind of like mukbang style of like, I can just eat as much as possible and chase these really high body weight goals is also driven by the enhanced space. And we're here to talk about the natural space, right?
That's true. Yeah. You can have bigger body weight swings in a short period of time while still being quote unquote productive and making physique progress when you're enhanced. Like, your cuts can be much quicker. You can be much more aggressive with fat loss while you're still hold on or even build muscle. And also you can just build a lot more muscle very quickly. So like, you can use that massive calorie surplus to good use.
Exactly. So when we're talking about natural bodybuilding, or let's not even just use the term bodybuilding, natural physique development or building muscle as a natural person without the assistance of performance enhancing drugs, you do need to keep in mind that there is an actual rate at which your body can put on muscle. And if you chase a rate that's faster than that or higher than that, then what ends up happening is you're not actually putting on more muscle, you're just putting on more body fat, right? So
Yeah.
chasing a calorie surplus, there's not this linear relationship with, oh, I eat more calories, therefore I build more muscle. It
Yeah.
doesn't work that way. It's
Yeah.
our muscle requires some calories to build, so we have to supply that. But at the same time, it becomes a challenge when you're like, okay, well, I'll just keep eating all these calories, and those calories get used to build muscle, but the rest of those excess calories you're taking in from the additional calorie surplus, they're not going towards building muscle. They're going to get stored as body fat, which is the primary law of how we gain weight: excess calories.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that's the real important point to hit home is more food does not equal more muscle. Okay. And I think this is where a lot of people go wrong. You do, again, as you said, you do have to supply enough energy for the muscle building process, but it's not, and we're going to jump into this in a second, but like it's not as much as you probably would think.
Yes, exactly. And before we move into like unpacking that, I just want to provide like kind of the female perspective because that's what I do.
Yes, please.
When a lot of the fitness narrative has been around men chasing building muscle, because historically that's just been what it is. And now we're in this world today where a lot of more women are chasing building muscle, and that's like the best thing ever. Like I
Yeah.
love to see that. The challenge though is that we have this narrative, this outdated narrative, that to build muscle you have to be like gorging or binging or just like eating everything in sight, unstructured, just like whoa, like that. You know that SpongeBob meme where he's like eating
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
burgers? Like
Yeah.
it's that. And I think that's really discouraging a lot of women from building muscle because they think that they need to be eating this exorbitant amount of calories that's unrealistic for them and going to lead to excess body fat gains. And that's discouraging women from focusing on having a proper building phase. So,
Yeah.
my kind of like quote unquote secret agenda with doing this episode is also to say, like, no, we don't have to have this like excessive bulk to build muscle, so that it can also be made more approachable for women who don't want to put on a ton of body fat or also don't feel comfortable eating like an animal. Like, and I don't mean that to be rude to animals, but just like
Yeah.
eating like not an adult human.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I don't know. I think regardless, whether you're a guy or a girl or, just any person that's listening, I would say there's in no way, shape, or form is just adding excess body fat doing you any service in the context of physique development. Like there's no additional benefit to just putting on more body fat from a physique development standpoint. Because you think about it, if we're trying to optimize that, eventually we're gonna have to diet the fat off, right? Or run a fat loss phase. And if we just put on so much body fat, then that fat loss phase is going to be longer, which kind of sucks. It takes away time from us actually building muscle,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So glad you said that.
So, and also, like, depending how far you take it, you might actually decrease your state of health. Like some people
That's true.
that just
Yeah.
gain too much weight, then they might even have high blood pressure and they get out of breath easily and maybe sleep issues. If you really, really, take the building phase too far in terms of body fat,
No, the bulking phase too far.
the bulking phase,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. If
so
you
yeah.
focus on just, 100%. But that's why we wanted to clear things up. Is like there is this narrative that to build muscle, you have to like bulk excessively and have this insane calorie surplus where you're eating an exorbitant amount of calories, or you don't even know how many calories you're eating. You're just eating for the sake of eating. And that's what we're here to dispel today. We really want to dispel that myth. And it's okay that challenge exists because we know how we got there. People still think that way. But let's actually take a step back, look at the reality of what it takes to build muscle, look at the research that's been done on different, calorie intake levels and how they contribute to muscle growth. And then we're going to talk about some of the nuances between, if you're a more advanced lifter, somebody who's been training productively for a while versus kind of new to muscle building. We're going to tease out the differences that you need to keep in mind there. And then we're going to wrap things up with what does a productive muscle building phase actually look like and give you some really key practical takeaways that you need to kind of like check off as boxes to keep building muscle productively without an excessive body fat gain.
Got it. Let's do it.
All right. The research and the reality. We're diving right in. The reality is building muscle takes calories, right? Because energy is calories and muscle is energy demanding. It's energy demanding to build muscle. It's also energy demanding to maintain muscle. So there is a relationship between muscle and energy intake, aka muscle and calorie intake. And the narrative historically has been we need to have more and more energy coming in order to direct more energy towards building muscle. What are your thoughts on that before we actually unpack the research that's been done so far?
I think too, it has flaws, and that statement obviously has flaws, but I get the logic behind it. Like, we need the energy to build the muscle. I just think it's the quantity of extra energy that's where we're false previously.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There was a research study that was done, and I'm looking at my notes here. We'll drop the PubMed article in the links below so everybody can go and take a look at it. But it really actually looked at how much excess calorie intake do you really need to build muscle?
And obviously, there's major nuances with the population
Huge.
that would who was the people who were the people that were training, how much they were training, and like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at least it starts to hint towards the direction that maybe we don't need to overeat by 1,000 calories a day if we're trying to optimize muscle growth. That's where it kind of pushes us in that direction. I wouldn't say we need to take this study and run with it, but it starts to paint
No.
that picture for us.
Exactly. And I think that's the most important takeaway. And this research was done in 2019, right? And what they were really trying to understand was, do we really need a surplus? Like, do we need a surplus? And I think the takeaway was, okay, maybe we do. And again, nuanced by individual context, but maybe it's not as big as we thought it used to be. And then that kind of unlocked the next bit of research around, okay, so like how big could it be, right? And that's where we got a more recent study. In 2023, it was actually a study led by Eric Helms, who we both respect hugely, because he is like the master of evidence-based lifting and fitness and nutrition when it comes to physique development. And they looked specifically about the effect of small versus large energy surpluses on things like strength, muscle, and what we're calling skin fold measurements. So essentially, caliper measurements that look at like body fat and kind of skin diameters and stuff like that. They also looked specifically at people who were lifters. So these are people who were quote unquote resistance trained, meaning they weren't completely new to the gym. They had been training for a while. And this study was probably the most impactful at suggesting to us what's actually needed in terms of calorie surplus requirements when it comes to building muscle. Do you want me to keep going with what the results were, or do you want to chime in?
No, I think I'm ready to hear it. Then I'll give my thoughts after. I don't want to.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
So same thing, we're going to drop the study in the notes here if you want to take a look at the details. But the conclusions were that for people who are resistance trained, they recommend a conservative energy surplus of between 5 and 20% over maintenance calories. So that, first of all, is a fairly decent range, right? It's like 5 versus 20% surplus is quite different. But it also is not an excessive amount of extra calories. And I think that's really important. We're going to talk about the nuances in a minute about like newer trainees versus more advanced trainees, but I'm going to just leave it there for a second with that first conclusion around a calorie surplus of 5 to 20%.
Yeah, so let's do some math on that, right? Let's just for the audience. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, somebody's maintenance calories, so the amount of calories that they can eat to maintain their weight is 2,000. Okay, so would that be, you're saying it's between like 2,050 to 2,200?
It'd be 2,100 if we're doing the 5.
Or 5%. Okay, yeah.
5%.
Great.
5% would be 2,100, which is basically actually aligned with, it's okay, we're not here to test your math skills, we're here to test your fitness knowledge. So that's okay. So the 5% is just an extra 100 calories a day, which is actually aligned a little bit with that initial study results, right? And if we scale that up to the 20%, then we're actually looking at, oh man, I just multiplied it by 2.2. That's not what I wanted to do.
2,400.
It should be 2,400. Yeah. So really we're looking for somebody whose maintenance calories is 2,000. Then their suggested calorie surplus to build muscle would be somewhere between 2,100 and 2,400. That's not a huge amount of extra food, or well, not amount of food, but amount of calories from food.
Yeah. But here's the thing also, I would probably think that's logical, even just because now we have such a large sample size of clients that, like, when I look at these studies, I'm thinking practically, okay, from what I've seen, and we're going to hop into a few more nuances later, but I would definitely say that would be somewhere, again, it's hard to really say percentage wise or exact surplus, because when you feed people up, they tend to move a little bit more, and some other things change, they train harder.
Good point.
Like, there's so many other things. So like, for you to actually calculate how much of a surplus is very difficult, but I will say I attempt to go by body weight ranges over time, which we're going to get to in a second, potentially. But if we're trying to hit a good surplus, like depending on the person, I would probably shoot for a range of between 150 to maybe 400 calorie surplus, depending on the person, if I was trying to like, ballpark it.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the fact that like movement can increase too, because if expenditure increases, then it changes the ratios between like
Yeah,
maintenance and surplus. Because
exactly.
if you're expending more, which we don't really know how to measure very well, and we've talked about that before, we don't have a very accurate way of measuring our daily expenditure. So if that like kind of intuitively changes, then your baseline maintenance goes up. That means the total calories to create that same surplus window also go up
Yeah,
logically,
they would
right?
have to go. Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's why there's so many nuances, but I do go, and you can talk about what the study said in terms of body weight gain over time, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
compare it to what I typically look for. But that's why I do mostly go for, if we are in a like intentional building phase, I do look at percent body weight gain per month. In a fat loss phase, I'll look at, weekly averages over time, rolling averages. But for muscle building phase, I usually look at like monthly rate of gain based off percentage of the person's body weight.
For sure. And we're going to come back to that in terms of measuring successful building progress and stuff in the end when we talk more about like what actually makes a productive building phase. But I
Yeah.
think it's really important that we marry the conversation around calorie intake and surplus with the fact that in order to see if that's accurate for you, not just take this number and go with it,
Mm-hmm.
measuring your body weight progression, let's say, is important. Amazing. Okay, so we've got that 5 to 20% range in terms of 5 to 20% surplus. Now, the one really important thing here is how do you decide, right? If you're closer to 5 or closer to 20. And I think, of course, there's a ton of individual context that needs to be considered. However, one of the number one variables that we need to talk about here is your training experience, right? And as we said, this study was done among people who have a resistance training background, but there's still some breadth between people who are kind of like newer to training and have a little bit more experience. So we're going to call them like, let's say beginners versus advanced lifters, just for the simplicity of language. I want you to do your caveat that you always do around like, can we just quickly define
Yeah. Yeah.
beginner in this context before we actually tease out the nuances for calorie surplus?
Yes. So when we look at your development and training, if you're a beginner all the way to advanced, it's not how much time you have been training. It's the amount of time spent doing things properly. And I talk with a lot of people who have been training for years, but are still technically a beginner in their development. And I know that might sound crazy, but that's why when we look at if you're advanced or not, it's again not a time based. Oh, I've been lifting for X amount of years. How long I've been doing things properly and intentionally, with the variables controlled that are important for physique development.
Exactly, exactly. And so that is kind of how we're choosing to define beginner. It's like if you had that structured programming, if you've been working on progression, if you've had your training oriented specifically around muscle building variables, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Now,
and nutrition to tie into that
and nutrition. Oh
progression
my
as
God, the
well. Yeah,
nutrition has to be part of it too, right? We're talking about beginner versus advanced lifters, but you're so right. Like if your nutrition variables haven't been dialed in, you haven't necessarily maybe tapped out on your quote unquote beginner muscle building progress
yeah,
yet, right?
yeah.
Yeah. We are going to talk about that, but I realize there is something I do want to allude to before we dive in. If you are a beginner, that also does not necessarily correspond to like your current body composition. It often does, but because, if you're more advanced, then typically your body composition reflects that. But if you are somebody who is starting out with a little bit more body fat already, and we go back to kind of where we started the conversation around the initial idea that building muscle takes energy. Well, stored body fat is energy, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So if you are trying to build muscle, you don't need to be in a calorie surplus, especially if like, you're trying to just go for body recomposition where you're still losing body fat, then you have stored energy already. So you do not need to be worried about, calorie surpluses. You should be focused on probably a little bit more body recomposition where you can lose fat and build muscle at the same time. We've talked about that before, but keep in mind, you have the energy to build muscle stored in extra stored body fat.
Yeah. And when we talk about this conversation, it is important that for beginners, like people say, oh, how much of a surplus? You don't even need a surplus. You could be in a deficit, maintenance, or surplus and still gain a good amount of muscle. Like, I don't know how many clients now we have examples of running a fat loss phase when they first start working with us and also adding new muscle. Because again, they're technically, no matter how long they've been training, they're technically not advanced yet, right? Because they haven't dialed in all the variables at once simultaneously for a long enough period of time. So I like if you're first starting, like you don't really even need to worry about how much of a surplus, unless you're starting like very quote unquote skinny or slender, and you really want to just put on overall body mass
Yeah. If you've heard the term skinny fat before, like I don't love that term, but it's very colloquial. People use it, right? Somebody who you have maybe a smaller frame, but you don't have a lot of muscle on you. You're not necessarily that lean either. That might be an application for exactly what you're talking
I would to play devil's advocate. I would actually put maintenance or is still in a slight deficit
about for
for
that
that
person.
for a skinny
Yeah.
fat person.
For skinny fat.
I'm talking
Good
about
point.
people who have no muscle and no body fat. Then definitely
Well,
with a
then you're
mixture
saying,
of
okay, so you're talking
yeah,
about
yeah.
people who are like, yeah. Because if you're skinny fat, quote unquote, you still have body fat to lose,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
are probably the most eligible for that body recomposition.
Yeah, but if
We're
you
talking about.
are not carrying that much body fat or muscle whatsoever, these conversations of you begin your fitness journey entering right into a surplus, and because you're a beginner and you will make gains quickly, your surplus could probably be a little bit more assertive than later on, right? So which way
Yeah,
up?
and that's exactly what the study concluded too, right? If you are kind of beginner and you have, the opportunity to really build some muscle and you don't have a lot of stored body fat, you can go more up to that 20% surplus range. But now on the
Okay.
flip side, if you are an advanced trainee, you've been at this playing this game for a while, you've already built some muscle, that's where it's more advantageous to actually stick on that lower end of the range of maybe more the 5%. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I would definitely be aligned with that. Like if I look at our more advanced clients, or even myself, and even like clients like Manene, who just have been training for so long, doing things properly, like the surplus that we try to snipe is almost indetectable. And you know what I mean? Like the way I phrase it to people like that is we're trying to create the environment with enough food, recovery, and a stimulus of training to elicit an adaptation of muscle growth. But I'm not looking necessarily for a certain body weight gain per month or anything like that. I'm more looking at visuals and getting qualitative feedback and seeing how the body's responding. And we're just trying to create the right environment for muscle growth, which is crazy, right? And that's why these things, we can't take them all like black and white when it comes to these
No,
things.
we can't. But I think it's nice to have like the initial direction and then kind of gut
Yeah,
check it against real
100%.
experience. And also, I do think it is important to have the research on this stuff because it provokes the conversation and also dispels old ways of thinking, right? So yes, this is going to be completely person dependent. And I also really like that this research gave a range and said, hey, we need to consider all these individual variables. But like now we have a starting point to dispel those old myths around
Yes.
like, oh, just like eat as much as possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where like if you are more advanced, like sticking that 5%, I think it also gives you a little bit of peace of mind to be like, I don't have to quote unquote eat more or do more to see progress. And that's a good thing too. Just like focus on what you're really focusing on well and have trust in that process because there is at least some guidance around it on the back end. There
Exactly.
is one thing though that you just mentioned I really want to spend a moment on, which is creating that environment for growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once we talk about this, it's going to naturally lead us into our conversation on what makes a productive muscle building phase. But
Mm-hmm.
the analogy I come back to time and time again is training is your match, nutrition is your gasoline. So here we are having this conversation about the right calorie intake range and do we need a calorie surplus? If so, how much? That sort of thing. But if you are just focusing on your calories and your training isn't structured, isn't specific, doesn't follow any muscle building variables, hypertrophy variables, and is not something you're consistent with, and you're not even training hard to begin with, we're having the wrong conversation.
Yeah, exactly. The signal to actually tell our body to build more muscle is going to be training. Okay. And then we follow that up with then the right environment for it to be able to do that, as we said before.
Right.
But if we are missing a good training stimulus, all the extra food is not going to go to the right places that you want it to. So, for example, if I was just here doing boot camp classes in Pilates and then eating in a 400 calorie surplus, I'm not going to gain that much muscle at all.
Because you haven't
So,
triggered the muscle building response in the muscle.
yeah, I haven't told my body, hey, add a little bit here, add a little bit here type thing. I've just been, moving my body, which is great for health, but we're talking about how can we optimize muscle growth. And so I think we need to first say, is our training really dialed in before we introduce a surplus? Don't introduce a surplus if your training's not dialed in, or else you're just probably going to put on more body fat than you want.
Yep, exactly. So focus on training first and then focus on, okay, what calorie range makes sense to complement my training and to get the most back out of my training efforts. Because that's the thing too, right? Like when you put all this hard effort into your training, like you want it to pay off, right? But if it's not there, then it's like, okay, well, we can't expect the payoff.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk about what makes a productive building phase, muscle building phase. And I think let's start with where we began this conversation, which is around calories, right? what kind of calorie intake level, or how do we approach calories for the most productive muscle building phase?
Yeah. So first things first, what I will say is like, this is kind of on the side of this, but start from a good spot too. So let's say the person who should enter
Hmm.
specific muscle
Great
building
point,
phase,
actually.
right? Let's
Yeah,
just say
before,
that.
yeah, I love that you brought that up, because the productivity starts with like your baseline,
Yeah.
not just,
So
hey, I have a calorie target, let's go for it.
exactly. So I would say somebody that is at a leanness that they're comfortable with. So if they were to gain a little bit of body fat, they would be okay with that. So they're starting relatively lean, already have good training dialed in and everything like that, or putting that into place at the same time, um, and want to just add some more muscle and shape onto the frame. That's the
Nice.
type of person that we're talking to right now. And I think the way I try to phrase it is, it would be nice if you had the data on your calories already from like either a previous fat loss phase or what amount you maintain on. If not, you're just going to take your best guess and then see how kind of things unfold. But I would say personally, starting from that point, I would say probably somewhere between 150 to maximum 400 calorie surplus per day if you're on the highest end, is what I would set as like a reasonable surplus for somebody. But again, I look at more rate of body weight gain over time. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple of things you said in there that I want to expand on, but I think one thing you said was like somebody who's starting from a level of leanness that they're comfortable with adding a little bit of body fat, right? Like body fat is kind of the cost of doing business. It doesn't mean that, you need to put on a lot, but expect maybe a little bit of body fat gain. But what we're here today to talk about is like, how do we moderate that so that we're focusing mostly on building muscle in that process? So we'll talk about the rate of gain in a second. But the other thing you said was it's advantageous if you maybe know what your calorie ranges have been before, right? And you mentioned potentially somebody who's done a fat loss phase. Something I did want to say is like your fat loss calories are not quote unquote your starting point for your calorie surplus, right?
No.
Because your fat loss calories are a calorie deficit. So you do need to kind of understand your maintenance calories. We're not saying add 150 to 400 calories on top of your fat loss calories. That's not it. You need to know your maintenance first, which brings me to two things. One is if you haven't done a maintenance phase before, then you might want to focus there before hopping just straight into a calorie surplus and a muscle building phase. One, you might see some muscle growth anyways if it's newer to you. But also too is like you do need to have kind of those skills of like how do you actually manage your nutrition? What does training feel like when you're eating, maintenance, that sort of thing? And those skills will be really helpful for then, making sure you're also getting the most structure from your muscle building phase. And that brings me to the second point I wanted to make is like if you have a background in like daily structure, routine structure, training structure, and everything, like that is really important as well. So if you don't have that, if you haven't spent time getting your training in check, if you don't know what it's like to have a structure around food that makes it easy to be consistent with a higher calorie target, then maybe focus on establishing those things first.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah. So love that you gave some energy into who is most eligible for a productive building phase. Now we talked about sufficient calories, but not excessive calories. We gave some example ranges of, that 5 to 20% surplus, depending on your experience level, depending on your starting body composition, and also then making sure that the rate of gain kind of matches that level of surplus. So we're going to now talk about that rate of gain a little bit more, and how do we make sure that that surplus remains productive. We're not kind of overdoing the surplus. We're not underdoing the surplus. Let's start with the rate of body weight change. Or actually, before we talk about the rate of body weight change, what progress metrics or variables do we actually look at to validate if that surplus makes sense for us?
Yeah, so visuals are big. Again, as you guys can see, this conversation is very nuanced, and there's a lot of sometimes I'll make decisions just based on intuition for our clients in building phases without being like, this is the exact number that told me to do this. You know what I mean? So,
and you also have to consider the person in front of you. That's part of it too, right?
Exactly.
It's because people
so
aren't
individual.
numbers. It's so individual, and your intuition is based on your experience working with that person and people similar to them. So I do want to say that it's not like you're not pulling things out of thin air. Like your intuition is very well founded in real experience.
Yeah, and basically just pattern recognition. That's ultimately what leads to it, right? But I would say, yeah. So you're asking me rate of gain per month. Is that what you're saying?
Just how before we get there, how we measure progress. And you're talking about visuals,
Sorry,
right? You mentioned visuals.
Yeah. So first things first, progress pics between every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the person. I'll definitely want to see those in the same context, same lighting, and we have like a tutorial on how to do that for our clients as well. That's the first one. That's like a big one for me is the visuals. The second one, go ahead. What are you gonna say?
And I want to just stick on visuals for a second because that we've talked about this in the context of fat loss of like we don't actually control where our body loses body fat, but it's the same with adding. So the visuals also can help you detect, hey, are we maybe adding more body fat in some areas? Are we seeing more fullness in other areas? Is this actually muscle development in certain areas? And actually seeing the goal, right? Like not just the indicators of the goal, but seeing the goal, which is development and structure and all that type
Yes.
of thing
And
playing
that
out.
also gives that gives me information for how I should program. Because let's say somebody has muscle groups that are really taking off. I'm like, whoa, we can back off the volume there and put a little bit more love to somewhere else.
Good point.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Like if
that's
somebody
really
all of a
important.
sudden like, you see the visuals and it doesn't matter what their body weight change looked like, but like their shoulder caps all of a sudden like came in, like their
Mhm.
delts just exploded. You'd be like, okay, wow, awesome. Clearly we've added muscle there, but maybe we didn't see as much visual change in, I don't know, making this up, quads. Okay,
Mhm.
let's adjust your training to
Shift.
then focus
Yeah,
more on the quads. Yeah, got
exactly.
it.
So
Nice.
that's
I love
that's
that you
why
brought that up.
visuals are so important. The second one is definitely body weight. Okay. Over time, I don't want just holding body weight for 6 months if we're like really focused on how can we put on, significant amounts of muscle. So, and we're going to talk about rates again in a second. And then the other one is training performance. So are
Mm-hmm.
we getting, stronger over time? And also asking them, how are you feeling in the gym? Are we getting good pumps? Are we feeling energetic even towards the end of our sessions? Are we feeling just subjectively strong? Are we feeling good connection with our muscle groups? Like, are you feeling like you're adding muscle when you look in the mirror at the gym? Like, are you, is your t-shirt hugging the arms a little bit more? Or your glutes filling out your leggings a bit more, when you look in the mirror at the gym? So those are all things I want to hear.
So when we're talking about assessing muscle growth, we talked about visuals, rate of gain, which we're going to unpack a little bit further, and subjective indicators specifically around training performance and physical feeling of your muscles, right?
Yes. Yeah. And some
Okay.
training is, I guess, objective because the numbers are going up or they're not. But yeah,
Yes,
the subjective too.
definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I like that you just approach it from a subjective lens because like you have to know how that person feels. But if your training performance in terms of your numbers, strength, technique stays good, but your strength is going up, you're moving heavier loads, you're progressing on your reps, that sort of thing, that is a really good indicator that you're building muscle
Yes.
because muscle is
Yeah.
doing the work, right? So that's a great indicator. Let's just go back quickly to that rate of gain and actually give away what we keep alluding to talking
Yeah.
about is, when it comes to body weight, because we started this with like putting on body weight doesn't mean you're building muscle. That's just
Mm-hmm.
that's the truth. Yes, muscle has weight to it, but so does body fat. And so when we're in an excessive calorie surplus, then chances are we're going to be putting on more body weight from body fat than muscle because muscle just takes way more time to build. It's way slower. So we do need to be considerate of like how quickly are we gaining weight? Because
Yeah.
if we're gaining weight really fast, then chances are we're putting on more body fat
Mm-hmm.
than muscle, right?
Yes. Yes.
But like you also
Exactly.
said, you don't want to see no change in the scale weight,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's something you also said because you do want some sort of mass to be added from muscle, right?
Yeah, yeah, and this is tough because again, there's so many nuanced things about this. But I will say, if I had to just put as like a summary of what I'm looking for, depending on the level of advancement, lower end in terms of rate of gain for people that are more advanced, and higher end for people that are less advanced, between 1 to 2% of their body weight per month
So
is
that's very
typically.
similar to the study results, which was 0.25 to 0.5% per week. So if you extrapolate that over the month, that's
Oh, it's
exactly
the
what you
same.
just said. It's the
Okay, yeah.
same.
I just don't like looking at it as a week because you have fluctuations. I think it's
Yeah, I know.
okay, yeah.
Same. But I was just saying, like,
Oh,
you
that's
either
fine.
read
Yeah.
the study or you are spot on with what's most productive.
Well, that's why I say you can even ask some people this week. I've said that in our check-ins. If shout out John, who we did a podcast before with, who 1 or 2 weeks ago. If you're listening to this, I'm pretty sure I said that to you in your check-in. But so I'm not just making up from the study. But yeah, so that's kind of the range I'm looking for. However, I also this is a funny term that you might find hilarious, but sometimes I'll just let people marinate at the same body weight and just focus on
Marinate.
and just focus on just really great
Just
training,
sit in
eating their
it.
protein, and just sit at a certain body weight. Not the
Yeah.
beginning of the building phase, but let's say we're like halfway through, right? And I know where food is already getting higher and body weight's kind of not trending up. Maybe we've been there for like 3 to 4 weeks. sometimes we'll just be like, let's just sit there and marinate a little bit, especially if we're not like super, super lean, right? If you're holding some body fat already, like we don't need to just keep pushing body weight up, especially if training's going really well or progressing, visuals are going in the right direction. So yeah, sometimes we'll just let them marinate at a what is, I think, a productive body composition for them to build muscle at. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now, to be honest. Like my body weight I've been in this building phase for almost a year. And to be honest, my body weight has stayed fairly consistent. Maybe a 3 pound difference in that year, like 3-4 pounds. And I am eating in a calorie surplus, to be honest. I'm not at like maintenance calories, but my activity level has changed over time too. Like I do other things outside the gym, like volleyball, snowboarding, stuff like that. So expenditure has been a little bit higher, but also like my training has been super productive. My numbers have been going up. So there's no need to necessarily like push up body weight even more, especially because, as coach says, my physique is looking pretty good, right? Like we're seeing the visual changes. So you got to look at all that data combined.
Yes.
It's nice to have guidelines for rate of gain because I think it also holds people back from maybe pushing it too far. That's what the guidelines do. But it also doesn't mean that you have to follow those guidelines. And if you're not seeing that rate, that something's wrong because you have all these other things you need to be looking at, especially your visuals and also your training performance, as you've talked about.
Exactly. And just as we say for a successful fat loss phase, it's kind of like an art form. Same thing with a successful building phase. There's an art to putting on a lot of muscle without putting on crazy amounts of body fat over time. There is an art to that. And I think what people do is they get really hyper focused in a fat loss phase and dial in everything. Then in a building phase, they get super sloppy and they just eat whatever, take out a bunch of times. They're drinking more. Their sleep goes down the tube. They're also like just not training with the same intent as they did in the fat loss phase. Maybe they stop following the program. Like they stop with the good meal timing. Like they drop all these variables that made them successful in the fat loss phase, where the people who have really productive building phases, they take all the skills and the way they set their lifestyle and systems up in a fat loss phase. They do the same thing in the building phase, but with introducing a little bit more flexibility with things.
Yeah.
And maybe a few more fun foods that they didn't have before, a little bit extra food, obviously. Mm-hmm. And maybe the meal time doesn't have to be as precise as in a fat loss phase.
Yeah,
it's just, let's not think about our phases as like completely so different from each other. We should kind of think of them as like we're just operating slightly differently here and there.
You just are existing as like somebody with fitness skills, somebody with lives a fitness lifestyle, and then I'm going to use this term for lack of a better expression, but like the margin of error just widens kind of when you're in a building phase. Like your overall calorie ranges can be wider, right? And then means your food selection can be wider, your meal timing can be wider. So it's just like you get a little more range out of a productive building phase, but that range has the same structures. It's the same variables that you're paying attention to. It's the same structures around your own routines and lifestyle that really ultimately work. And it's kind of deciding like, hey, I'm going to superimpose all these skills I've built in fat loss phases and just use them in a building phase and then just widen the ranges that I'm working within.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Love it.
Amazing. Okay. So let me ask you the question. And, there's a lot of nuance. We tried to cover as much of it as we could in a reasonable time allowance. But in the last 40 minutes, if you had to give me a quick answer, do you have to bulk to build muscle? What are you going to do as a summary for us?
I'm going to say no, you do not have to bulk to build muscle. I would even say you don't even need a surplus to build muscle. However, with a caveat, if you are trying to optimize muscle growth, if you say, hey, Paris, I want to build a significant amount of muscle while keeping it reasonable with body fat gain in the next year, would I recommend a surplus? Absolutely.
But a reasonable surplus, somewhere between 5 to 20%, based on your experience level, how dialed in you are with your variables, and looking at all those progress indicators that we talked about to make sure you are focusing on building muscle, not just adding body fat. Because scale weight going up does not mean you are building muscle.
Exactly. And because it's so hard to say, I'm in a 5% calorie surplus, instead I look at body weight gain over time, rate of gain versus like what percentage of surplus. I mean, it's just more
perfect. But anyways. Amazing. So hopefully that made the idea of building muscle feel, you know what, I'm going to say it, feel a little more desirable, right? Like, and a little bit more approachable, a little bit more structured, and a little bit more precise, because there is an art to it. As you said, Paris, like there's an art of structure and precision, and we're here to do our best to like bring that structure and precision forward for people. It doesn't mean it's always easy in practice, right? The nuances don't make it as straightforward as sometimes we wish it were, but it gives us an opportunity to have discussions at an individual level and make sure that when we say we're optimizing for muscle growth, it's like we're doing it with that person in mind by applying all the principles that we talked about today. And this hopefully gives people a lens of the things we look out for as coaches when we're trying to help people build muscle.
Awesome. Great.
Alrighty. So without further ado, I think we'll wrap it up there for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss future ones, or share this with somebody who you think would actually really benefit from this. If you have a friend who's trying to build muscle right now and maybe they're not quite sure if they're making progress, send this to them. And you can add your own commentary when you pass it along as well and give them your thoughts. All right. So without further ado, we'll leave you for this week and we'll be back in your feeds with another episode of Truth Talks next Monday. Bye for now.